Harold Mitchell was a man of routine. On the morning of October 12, 1992, he followed the same pattern he had for years. He rose early, poured himself a cup of coffee, and drove out to check the edges of his cornfield in Millerville, Kansas. By evening, his truck was found still running on the dirt road near the field. His coffee cup was sitting in the holder, still warm. But Harold was gone. When a neighbor passed by and saw the unattended vehicle, he expected Harold to appear within moments. Minutes turned into an hour, and the uneasy truth became clear. Something had happened. The neighbor looked inside the truck. Harold's jacket was still on the seat. His keys were in the ignition, and the engine idled steadily. Nothing suggested he had planned to leave. The call reached the Millerville Sheriff's Department, and Deputy Raymond Holt arrived with 2 officers. They checked the truck, walked the edge of the field, and called Harold's name into the night. There was no reply. A single boot print was found in the soil, but it led nowhere. The ground beyond was rough, and the trail dissolved in the dry dirt. More deputies arrived, along with volunteers carrying flashlights. They searched the fields row by row, their voices breaking the silence of the night. They expected to find Harold collapsed or injured, but each hour passed with nothing. The truck sat like an open question, humming in the dark. By midnight, the search expanded. Dogs were brought in, but the trail ended abruptly near the edge of the field. It was as if Harold had stepped off the earth itself. His family waited in disbelief as officers explained the situation. No struggle was visible, no belongings were missing, and no explanation made sense. At dawn, the truck was finally shut off. The thermos of coffee had cooled, but Harold Mitchell had not returned. What began as an ordinary evening had turned into a mystery that unsettled an entire community. A man respected, dependable, and deeply rooted in his town had vanished without warning. And the first night of searching left everyone with the same chilling question. Where was Harold Mitchell? Harold Mitchell was 54 years old when he vanished. To those who knew him, he was more than just a farmer. He was the kind of man whose life was tied to the soil, whose identity was built around honesty, hard work, and quiet strength. He grew up in Millerville, Kansas, a town where everyone knew everyone else. Harold inherited the farm from his father, and he had spent his entire adult life working the land. He believed in early mornings, in sweat on his brow, and in finishing every task with care. People in town often said that if Harold promised to be somewhere at 6, he would be there at 5:50. Reliability was his nature. At home, Harold was a husband and father before anything else. His wife, Margaret Mitchell, described him as her steady ground. They had been married for over 30 years, and together they raised 2 children, David, the eldest, and Claire, their youngest. Both had moved into adulthood by 1992, but they remained close to their parents. Family dinners at the Mitchell home were a tradition, filled with stories of the farm, laughter, and Margaret's home-cooked meals. Harold loved those evenings, always ending with him leaning back in his chair, smiling as he listened to his children talk about their lives. Though his work kept him busy, Harold had passions outside the fields. He collected and restored old tractors, a hobby that combined his love of machinery with his patience for detail. Many weekends were spent in his barn, sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands, bringing rusted engines back to life. His collection was not about money. It was about history, about honoring the machines that once fed communities like his own. In Millerville, Harold was trusted. If a neighbor needed help repairing equipment or harvesting crops before the weather turned, Harold would show up. If someone fell ill, Harold would quietly deliver fresh produce from his farm. He did not seek recognition. His character spoke louder than words. That trust became part of why his disappearance struck so deeply. People respected him because he represented the values they held dear: loyalty, honesty, and hard work. He never involved himself in drama or disputes. To imagine Harold walking away from his family and responsibilities was impossible, and to imagine someone harming him felt unthinkable. The Mitchell family's life was not extraordinary, but it was stable and full of meaning. They had plans for the future, dreams of passing the farm on to the next generation, and the comfort of knowing their roots ran deep in Kansas soil. That sense of security shattered the moment Harold disappeared. When investigators began piecing together the case, They did not just lose a man. They lost a cornerstone of their community. Harold was a neighbor people leaned on, the friend who never failed, and the husband and father who never let his family down. His absence was not only a tragedy for Margaret and their children, but for the entire town of Millerville. The mystery of Harold's disappearance was not only about a missing farmer. It was about how a life so solid, so dependable, could be cut away in a single night. And for those who loved him, that question would haunt them for decades. October 12, 1992, began like any other day for Harold Mitchell. He woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his wife, Margaret. The harvest season was in full swing, and Harold planned to spend the day checking machinery and preparing for a long week of work. He kissed Margaret goodbye, grabbed his thermos, and stepped out into the cool morning air. By mid-afternoon, neighbors saw him driving his pickup along the edge of his property. He stopped briefly at the feed store in town, exchanging a few words with the clerk about the coming frost. Nothing seemed unusual. Harold was in good spirits, calm and steady as always. The last confirmed sighting came around 5:30 p.m. A farmhand working on a nearby field waved as Harold's truck passed by. Harold lifted his hand in return. That simple gesture would become the last normal moment anyone remembered. Not long after, his truck was discovered idling on a dirt road near his cornfield. The engine hummed softly. The headlights glowed faintly against the dusk. Inside, his thermos still radiated warmth, and the steam from his coffee curled faintly in the cooling air. His jacket was on the seat. The keys were in the ignition. But Harold was gone. Thomas Green, a longtime neighbor, noticed the truck as he drove home from town. At first, he thought Harold must have stepped into the field to check something. But after waiting several minutes, he realized something was wrong. He called out Harold's name, his voice carrying into the corn, but no reply came. That silence felt heavier than the night itself. When deputies arrived, they examined the scene carefully. On the ground near the truck, a single muddy boot print was pressed into soil. It was larger than Harold's size and faced toward the field. Just beyond, faint tire tracks cut into the dirt, as if another vehicle had stopped briefly before reversing out. Investigators noted them, uncertain if they were connected, but the details planted early doubts in their minds. As word spread, volunteers gathered quickly. Flashlights flickered between the rows of corn as men and women from Millerville searched into the night. They expected to find Harold injured, perhaps fallen or trapped by equipment. But the deeper they looked, the stranger became. No torn clothing, no signs of struggle, no dropped belongings. Nothing explained why his truck stood abandoned. Coffee still warm, life paused mid-motion. By midnight, the search widened into nearby woods and ditches. The dogs brought to the scene followed a trail only briefly before stopping, circling in confusion and losing the scent. Investigators described it as if the trail had been cut away. The Mitchell family stood on the roadside, waiting in anguish. Margaret clutched her children's hands, her eyes fixed on the endless rows of corn that swallowed the night. Officers tried to reassure her, but their own unease was obvious. When the sun rose the next morning, the scene had not changed. Harold's truck was now silent, its fuel tank empty. The thermos of coffee sat untouched. What should have been another ordinary day in Millerville had become the beginning of a nightmare. The man who was the heart of his family, the neighbor everyone depended on, had vanished without leaving a trace. As the first full day ended, one thing became painfully clear. This was no simple disappearance. Something darker had happened in that field. The disappearance of Harold Mitchell quickly escalated into a full investigation. Sheriff's Deputy Raymond Holt, the head of the Millerville Sheriff's Department, took command of the search. Holt was a seasoned officer, known for his calm presence and methodical approach. But even he admitted privately that the circumstances made little sense. On the first day, deputies established a perimeter around the Mitchell farm. Volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder, combing through the cornfields row by row. Some carried lanterns, others flashlights, their beams sweeping across the stalks that rattled in the wind. Every hour, more residents arrived to help. Millerville was a small town, and Harold's absence felt personal to all of them. Deputies extended the search to the nearby woods, creeks, and drainage ditches. Bloodhounds were brought in from a neighboring county, but the dogs lost Harold's scent within a short distance of the truck. That detail unsettled investigators. It suggested that Harold had not wandered off on his own. Something, or someone, had interrupted his routine. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the farmland with spotlights. From above, the field stretched endlessly, golden and quiet, but no sign of Harold appeared. The searchers returned each night with nothing more than exhaustion and growing fear. As the investigation moved forward, suspicion began to shift. Holt and his team considered whether Harold had been taken by someone passing through. Millerville sat near a highway often traveled by drifters and long-haul truckers. Deputies stopped strangers, checked motels, and questioned anyone unfamiliar in town. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed Harold had been robbed. Others whispered about old farmland disputes. But none of it turned into solid evidence. Meanwhile, flyers were printed and distributed across Kansas. Harold's face, smiling in a photograph from a family gathering, was posted in grocery stores, gas stations, and church halls. His family gave statements to the press, pleading for information. Margaret's voice broke as she begged anyone with knowledge to come forward. Despite the intensity of the effort, days passed with no progress. Each search ended the same way, with silence. Holt and his deputies found themselves circling back to the truck again and again, looking for details they might have missed. The muddy boot print, the faint tire marks, the warm coffee. None of it offered the answers they needed. For the Mitchell family, the waiting was unbearable. They sat in their living room late into the nights, the phone beside them, praying for news. But the calls that came were not breakthroughs. They were questions, dead ends, and false alarms. By the end of the first week, the investigation had grown larger, but the mystery only deepened. Holt gathered his men and admitted what many had begun to fear. There was no trace of Harold Mitchell anywhere, and every day without answers pushed the case further into the unknown. The shock of Harold Mitchell's disappearance spread through Millerville faster than any news had in years. By the second day, nearly every household in the small farming town knew. Conversations at the diner, at the feed store, and in church pews circled back to the same chilling fact. Harold was gone, and no one knew where. At the Mitchell home, Margaret clung to hope with a quiet determination. She kept the porch light on each night, as if Harold might step through the door at any moment. She told deputies and neighbors that Harold was strong, that he would never abandon his family, and that he had to be out there somewhere waiting to be found. Her voice carried conviction. But behind closed doors, she wept when her children could not see. David, their eldest, reacted with anger. He confronted deputies when days passed without results. "You are missing something," he told them more than once, convinced that the answer was just beyond their grasp. Claire, younger and softer in temperament, withdrew. Friends recalled seeing her at church, sitting silently in the back row, staring at the altar with a look of disbelief. Their father had been the anchor of their lives, and without him, they felt adrift. The town tried to hold the family together. Local church services were dedicated to Harold's safe return. Prayers were spoken aloud, candles lit, and hymns sung with trembling voices. Farmers who worked alongside Harold offered to help Margaret with the harvest, refusing to let the crops go to waste. Meals were delivered to the Mitchell home, neighbors stopping by not only with food but with words of comfort. But beneath the gestures of kindness lay an undercurrent of fear. Harold had been the picture of reliability, a man who represented safety and order in their world. If he could vanish without warning, then no one was truly secure. Parents kept children closer. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted at night. Conversations shifted from sympathy to suspicion. Someone whispered that perhaps Harold had enemies no one knew about. Others feared a stranger had passed through and could return at any time. The unity of the community was real, but it was fragile, held together by prayer and hope while anxiety gnawed beneath the surface. People wanted to believe Harold would come back, but the longer the silence stretched, the harder that belief became. Millerville was a town built on trust, but Harold's disappearance cracked its foundation, and with each passing day, the fracture grew deeper. In the weeks following Harold Mitchell's disappearance, investigators were desperate for answers. Every tip, Every rumor and every shred of gossip was followed with the same intensity, but none of it brought the sheriff's department closer to the truth. What began as hope soon became a maze of false leads that wasted precious time and energy. The first major lead came when a truck driver in Oklahoma reported seeing a man who looked like Harold at a roadside diner. The description matched Harold's age, height, and even the baseball cap he often wore. Detectives drove 6 hours to the diner, only to discover the man was a traveling salesman from Texas. He showed them his ID, laughed nervously at the comparison, and offered to let them call his wife for proof. What had started as a promising break ended in disappointment. Not long after, whispers spread around Millerville about a debt Harold might have owed. Some suggested he had borrowed money for new farm equipment and fallen behind on payments. The story grew in detail each time it was told. First, it was a small bank loan. Then it was a secret loan from a private lender with a reputation for intimidation. Investigators followed the trail, poring over Harold's financial records and interviewing lenders. They discovered that Harold's accounts were solid. He had no outstanding debts beyond the usual seasonal expenses, and he was known for paying his bills on time. The debt dispute theory collapsed under the weight of facts, but the rumors lingered in the town, making the Mitchell family suffer further humiliation. Another angle focused on Harold's seasonal farm workers. A few locals whispered that some of the men Harold had hired were drifters who came and went with the crops. Suspicion fell on one in particular, a young man who left town the same week Harold disappeared. Detectives tracked him down in Nebraska, where he was working another harvest. He denied any involvement and produced pay stubs and witness testimony, proving he had been there the entire time. Once again, what seemed like a breakthrough unraveled into nothing. Other theories emerged almost daily. Some believed Harold had been robbed by strangers passing through Millerville. Others speculated about long-standing disputes over farmland boundaries. A neighbor recalled an argument Harold had with another farmer about a drainage ditch, and suddenly that neighbor was treated like a suspect. He cooperated fully, but no evidence tied him to the case. Every false lead took a toll. Deputies grew exhausted, stretched thin by countless interviews and late-night calls. Resources were drained as the department pursued each rumor, only to circle back to the same unsettling truth. There was no solid evidence, no clear direction. For Harold's family, the false leads were even more painful. Each new theory raised their hopes, only to crush them when it proved hollow. Margaret clung to every possibility, waiting by the phone for news that never came. David's frustration boiled over. He accused investigators of chasing shadows, while his father's trail grew cold. Claire withdrew further, her grief deepening with every disappointment. Detective Raymond Holt admitted privately to colleagues that the case was slipping from his grasp. The leads came in like waves, each one loud and demanding, but none of them carried substance. He confessed in his notes that the investigation felt like chasing smoke in the wind. By the end of the third month, Millerville had grown weary. Flyers with Harold's face still hung in shop windows, but their edges curled in the sun. Conversations about him became quieter, as if people no longer knew what to say. The hope that once pushed the community forward was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and an unspoken fear. Harold Mitchell might never be found. By the end of 1993, more than a year after Harold Mitchell's disappearance, the search that once consumed Millerville slowed to a painful crawl. The flyers that once hung fresh in store windows now looked weathered, their ink fading under the Kansas sun. The helicopters had long stopped circling the farmland, and the volunteers who once combed the cornfields returned quietly to their own lives. What remained was silence, an unanswered question that no one could resolve. For the Mitchell family, that silence was unbearable. Every birthday, every anniversary, and every holiday became a reminder of Harold's absence. His empty chair at the dinner table seemed louder than any words. Margaret tried to keep family traditions alive, but her voice would break when she carved a Thanksgiving turkey or placed Harold's stocking by the fireplace. Their children, David and Claire, carried their grief in different ways. David's anger hardened into resentment, while Claire sank deeper into sorrow, unable to imagine a future without her father's steady guidance. Margaret, determined to honor her husband's memory, worked tirelessly to keep the farm running. Neighbors offered help, lending equipment, or spending long hours in the fields. But the burden was heavy. The stress of balancing work, family, and the endless wait for answers began to wear her down. By winter, friends noticed a change in her health. Her once strong posture now slouched, her face lined with exhaustion. She admitted to close friends that the weight of uncertainty was harder to carry than grief itself. For the detectives, the reality was grim. Every lead had been pursued, every rumor checked, and yet no evidence had surfaced. Sheriff Raymond Holt made the painful decision to file Harold's case under code. It was not abandonment, he told Margaret. It was procedure. But those words brought little comfort. The box of files sat on a shelf at the station, another unsolved mystery gathering dust. In town, the whispers grew faint. People still spoke Harold's name, but less often and usually in hushed tones. The community that once rallied in prayer and search efforts returned to routines, as people inevitably do. Yet beneath that return to normalcy, unease lingered. Harold's vanishing was a wound that had never healed, a reminder that tragedy could strike even the most trusted and beloved neighbor. Life in Millerville moved forward. The cornfields were planted, the seasons turned, and the years stretched on. But for the Mitchell family, time did not mend the pain. Harold's absence remained, a shadow over every milestone, a silence that refused to fade. For 26 years, the case of Harold Mitchell remained sealed inside a dusty file box. The evidence collected in 1992 had been preserved, but technology at the time had been too limited to unlock its secrets. By 2018, however, science had changed, and so had the determination of investigators. Detective Amy Rodriguez of the Kansas Cold Case Unit was assigned Harold's file in early spring. Known for her persistence and meticulous eye, Rodriguez believed that no case was ever truly unsolvable. She opened the aging folders and studied the photographs. Harold's idling truck, the muddy boot print, the abandoned coffee cup. To most, the evidence was old and lifeless. To Rodriguez, it was waiting for the right moment to speak. One of her first decisions was to re-examine the plaster cast of the boot print found near Harold's truck. Using digital scanning, the cast was compared against updated databases of footwear patterns. But while the match remained uncertain, Rodriguez did not stop there. She sent fragments of soil scraped from Harold's truck tires for modern analysis, hoping to uncover microscopic evidence that earlier science might have missed. The most important item, however, was a swab preserved from the truck's door handle. Back in 1992, DNA testing was in its infancy. The sample had been cataloged but never fully examined. In 2018, with advanced sequencing and improved contamination filters, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation finally had the means to process it. Weeks later, Rodriguez received a call that would change everything. The laboratory had detected a partial DNA profile. It was not strong enough for certainty on its own, but it was significant. When cross-checked against a national database, one name appeared: Daniel Price. Price was not a stranger. He had been a longtime family friend of the Mitchells and a respected church deacon in Millerville. In the months after Harold vanished, Daniel had been among those who comforted Margaret, offering prayers, visits, and words of encouragement. For decades, he had walked the same streets, shaken the same hands, and spoken in the same church pews as the rest of the community. To imagine him connected to Harold's disappearance felt unthinkable. Rodriguez studied the report in silence. A partial match did not prove guilt, but it opened a door that had been locked for over 2 decades. She revisited the case notes with fresh eyes. Witness statements from 1992 mentioned Daniel stopping by Harold's farm days before the disappearance, discussing repairs for a tractor. At the time, it was dismissed as normal. 2 friends talking about farm work. Now, paired with a DNA trace, it felt different. She pulled the plaster boot print from evidence storage once again. When scanned against Daniel's known footwear from the early 1990s, similarities began to emerge. It was not a perfect match, but enough to demand closer attention. The soil samples, too, revealed particles unique to a patch of land Daniel once leased near the Mitchell farm. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to rearrange itself. The revelation sent ripples through the cold case unit. Detectives who had once walked those fields as young officers now listened in disbelief. The the man who had stood beside Margaret in prayer circles, who had helped organize community searches, was now at the center of suspicion. Rodriguez knew this was no longer just about science. It was about unraveling a betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight. But before she could confront Daniel Price, she needed to build a case with precision. Decades of silence were about to be shattered, and once the truth surfaced, Millerville would never see him the same way again. The box that had gathered dust for 26 years was no longer closed. The evidence had spoken, and it had whispered the name of a trusted friend. Once Daniel Price's name appeared in the DNA database, Detective Amy Rodriguez could not let it go. The discovery was not just a lead. It was the first real crack in a wall that had stood for more than 2 decades. From that moment, the case stopped being part of her workload and became her personal mission. Rodriguez began by revisiting the Mitchell family. Margaret Mitchell, now in her 70s, lived quietly in a small house near the edge of town. Age and grief had carved deep lines in her face, but her voice was steady as she spoke about her late husband. When Rodriguez gently brought up Daniel Price, Margaret's expression changed. She admitted that Daniel had been supportive after Harold vanished, visiting often, sometimes too often. At the time, she thought it was kindness. Looking back, it seemed almost intrusive. David and Claire, Harold's children, added their own memories. They remembered Daniel being unusually present during those first weeks, offering help with chores and prayer. David recalled his father had once argued with Daniel over a boundary line between their farms. "It was nothing serious," David said, "but my dad was stubborn, and Daniel, he held grudges." Claire remembered hearing whispers about Daniel's gambling debts in the early 90s, but at the time, the family dismissed them as rumors. Rodriguez took notes carefully, her mind drawing lines between the fragments. She then returned to Millerville itself. Walking through the town, she felt the weight of history in every corner store and church pew. Older residents were cautious when she brought up Daniel's name, but eventually, stories began to emerge. One farmer spoke of Daniel's envy when Harold expanded his acreage. Another mentioned how Daniel often borrowed money, but repaid late, if at all. A retired deputy recalled that Daniel had a temper, though he hid it well behind polite manners and a soft voice. The deeper Rodriguez dug, the more she saw how Daniel's reputation had shielded him from suspicion. In 1992, he was a church deacon, a man who prayed loudly on Sundays and shook every hand with warmth. To accuse him of involvement in Harold's disappearance would have seemed impossible. That was why Rodriguez realized no one had looked too closely at him. She revisited the old witness statements from the original investigation. Buried among the pages was a note about a pickup truck parked near Harold's field on the day he vanished. The vehicle was described as dark green, with a dent in the back bumper. At the time, it was dismissed. But Rodriguez discovered that Daniel owned a green truck in the early 90s, sold quietly months after Harold's disappearance. The pieces were no longer scattered fragments. They were forming a picture of a man with debts, grudges, and hidden anger, traits that had gone unnoticed beneath his outward charm. Rodriguez felt both excitement and dread. Excitement, because she was closer than ever to answering the question of what happened to Harold. Dread, because the suspect was not an outsider or a drifter, but someone Harold's family had once trusted completely. Every night, Rodriguez stayed late at her desk, reviewing files, listening to old interview tapes, and building the case brick by brick. She knew she was getting close, but she also knew that with every new discovery, the betrayal grew deeper. The truth was tightening its grip around Daniel Price, and soon Rodriguez would be ready to confront him. The interview room was silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead light. Detective Amy Rodriguez sat across from Daniel Price, a man the town of Millerville had trusted for decades. His hands rested neatly on the table, his eyes calm, as if he believed his good reputation would shield him forever. Rodriguez began carefully. She presented him with photographs of Harold's truck, the boot print, and the DNA report. "Daniel," she said evenly, "your DNA was found on Harold's truck. You were at that field the day he disappeared." Daniel leaned back, shaking his head. "That is impossible. I visited Harold often. Everyone knew that. Of course my DNA might be somewhere near his things. That proves nothing. His voice was steady, but his fingers tapped nervously on the table. Rodriguez did not argue. Instead, she pushed forward with the details. Witness statements. The green pickup truck seen near Harold's cornfield. The old land dispute between the two men. Each piece stacked on top of the other, until Daniel's calm exterior began to crack. You helped his widow search for him, Rodriguez continued, her tone firm. You stood in his home. You prayed in his church, all while knowing where Harold Mitchell truly was. Why, Daniel? For the first time, Daniel's composure faltered. His jaw clenched, and his eyes shifted downward. Still, he whispered, You are wrong. Hours passed. Rodriguez left the room, then returned, each time laying down another fragment of truth. The soil samples linking Daniel's old property to Harold's field. The partial boot print compared with Daniel's footwear. The timeline that showed he had both motive and opportunity. Finally, the weight of it pressed too heavily against him. Daniel's shoulders slumped. His voice, once polished and confident, dropped to a whisper. He pushed me too far. Rodriguez leaned in. Tell me what happened. Daniel exhaled slowly, his words spilling out with bitterness that had been hidden for years. He admitted that on that October morning in 1992, he met Harold near the edge of the cornfield. They argued about the land boundary, a dispute that had simmered beneath their friendship for years. Harold refused to give in, insisting the land was his by right. I could not stand it any more, Daniel muttered, his eyes fixed on the table. He had everything, the farm, the respect, the family. And I was drowning in debt. The argument escalated. Daniel confessed he struck Harold with a heavy wrench he had carried in his truck. Harold collapsed, and in that moment, Daniel realized what he had done. Panic took over. Instead of calling for help, he dragged Harold's body to a drainage ditch at the edge of the field. There, under cover of night, he buried the man who had once been his closest friend. Rodriguez listened in silence, allowing the truth to hang in the air. The confession was chilling not only for his violence, but for the cold calculation that followed. Daniel had lived for years as a trusted deacon, a neighbor, and a friend, all while hiding the secret. His friendly face had concealed bitterness, jealousy, and greed. When the words were finally recorded, Daniel leaned back in his chair. I thought it would stay buried forever, he said quietly. I thought no one would ever know. But now the secret was out, and the mask Daniel had worn for decades was gone. The truth had finally been spoken, and with it came the shattering realization. Harold Mitchell had not been lost to chance or fate. He had been taken by the very man who once stood closest to him. On a cold November morning in 2018, Daniel Price was led out of his modest home in handcuffs. The man once praised as a pillar of Millerville. The church deacon, the loyal neighbor, the trusted friend, was now accused of murdering Harold Mitchell. His arrest sent a shiver through the entire community. News spread quickly. People who had prayed beside Daniel, who had shared meals with him and sought his advice, struggled to comprehend the betrayal. For 26 years, Daniel had stood among them as a figure of faith and stability. Now they realized that every comforting word he had offered to Margaret and her children was poisoned by the knowledge of his guilt. Reporters descended on the small town, and cameras captured the stunned faces of lifelong residents. At the local diner, conversations turned into hushed disbelief. I cannot believe it, one woman whispered. He was the one who led prayers for Harold every Sunday. Another shook his head. All that time, he knew, for the Mitchell family, the arrest was both devastating and relieving. Margaret, now fragile but still resolute, wept when detectives told her Harold's remains had been found in the drainage ditch Daniel had described. After more than 2 decades of waiting, she would finally be able to bring her husband home. David and Claire stood by their mother as Harold's remains were laid to rest in Millerville Cemetery. The funeral was small, dignified, and filled with both grief and gratitude. The coffin was lowered into the ground beside the headstone that had carried Harold's name since the early 90s. For the first time, flowers were placed not just in remembrance, but in peace. Closure, however, came at a heavy cost. Margaret admitted quietly to friends that she still felt haunted by the years of uncertainty, the birthdays Harold missed, and the milestones their family celebrated without him. "We lost more than time," she said softly. "We lost a chance to grow old together." The community, too, was left scarred. Trust, once given freely, became cautious. Farmers who had leaned on one another now wonder how well they truly knew the men who worked beside them. The church congregation struggled to reconcile the voice that had once preached forgiveness with the hands that had buried a neighbor in the dirt. For Detective Rodriguez, the arrest closed one of Kansas's most haunting cold cases. But she carried with her the weight of what the truth revealed. That evil can live quietly in the most ordinary places, hiding behind a smile and a steady handshake. In the end, Daniel Price was not only guilty of murder, he was guilty of betrayal. Of Harold, of Margaret, of the Mitchell children, and of every person who had believed in him. The arrest did not erase the pain, but it gave the Mitchell family something they had long prayed for, an answer, and a grave where they could finally say goodbye. The story of Harold Mitchell's disappearance and the decades-long wait for justice is more than a tale of crime. It is a reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how easily darkness can hide behind a mask of kindness. For 26 years, the Mitchell family lived in uncertainty, clinging to hope while weighed down by grief. When the truth finally came in 2018, it brought both relief and sorrow. Relief in knowing what happened. Sorrow in realizing that the man responsible had been beside them all along. Margaret Mitchell, frail but unbroken, described her feelings simply. "I prayed for answers every night. I thought I wanted to know the truth. But when the truth came, it broke me all over again. Still, at least I can lay flowers at his grave now and know where my husband rests." Her words captured the bittersweet essence of closure. Answers had arrived, but they could never replace the years lost. David and Claire, who had grown into adulthood without their father, spoke about how his absence shaped their lives. David admitted to years of anger, not only at whoever had taken his father, but at the silence that followed. Claire reflected on the milestones, weddings, graduations, birthdays that felt incomplete. Every moment was a reminder that Dad should have been there. Now I know why he was not. And knowing hurts, but it also sets me free from the questions. Detective Amy Rodriguez offered her own perspective. She credited advances in forensic science for breaking open the case, but she also emphasized persistence. Science gives us tools, but persistence gives us results. This case was solved because we refused to let Harold's story be forgotten. Every cold case deserves that same commitment. Families deserve answers, no matter how long it takes. Her words echoed across Millerville, where the arrest of Daniel Price left scars on the community's collective memory. For many, the revelation was more painful than the crime itself. Daniel had not been a stranger or a drifter. He had been a neighbor, a friend, a spiritual leader. He prayed with families, offered comfort in times of loss, and led church gatherings that included prayers for Harold himself. All the while, he carried the weight of a secret. The betrayal was profound. Residents spoke quietly about how difficult it was to trust again. He shook our hands. "He broke bread with us," one man said. And all along, he was the one who put Harold in the ground. For a small farming town built on trust and neighborly bonds, the discovery cut deeply. Yet, even in the pain, there was resilience. The Mitchell family's endurance over 26 years became a testament to human strength. The dedication of investigators proved that justice, though delayed, could still prevail, and the community, though scarred, learned to confront the truth rather than bury it. In the end, Harold Mitchell's story is a cautionary tale about how evil can win the face of a friend and how patience, science, and determination can strip away even the most convincing disguise. It is a story about love lost, trust broken, and the painful but necessary power of truth. As the final chapter closed, the camera lingered on Harold's gravestone in the quiet cemetery of Millerville. A name that had once been tied to mystery was now tied to resolution. Flowers rested gently against the stone, placed by the family who had waited half a lifetime for this moment. Justice had come, but not without a price. And as the wind moved softly through the trees, one haunting truth remained. Sometimes the darkest evil does not come from strangers at the edge of town. It comes from the hands you trust the most.